Good day, friends. Welcome to another Word of Gord. Today we're continuing on with Azmina Suleiman's A Passage to Eternity. This detailed and closely argued experience and polemic arising therefrom of her NDE experience whilst on holiday in Florida some years ago. And needless to say, this is Average Folks in the Afterlife, number 71. Or maybe that is needless to say. Before the question of ethics and personal integrity could even come into play in my life, however, I knew that I would have to first pinpoint and narrow in on those unruly emotions and feelings that were making me act unconscionably in the first place. In the wake of this powerful realization, I could feel the dense mists of my forgetfulness begin to lift and slowly disperse from within the inner recesses of my mind. And there, stretched out in front of me along the vast expanse of eternity, stood several of my personalities from the past. As images randomly flashed through my mind, I could feel the first stirring of emotion. Before long, I found myself reliving moments of intense emotional highs and lows from my many lives lived on Earth. What seemed remarkable was the fact that even though I saw only snippets from those lives, I could recognize the full thrust and essence of any given lifetime simply by the intensity of emotion that welled up inside of me. As flashback after flashback let loose 1,000 fluttering feelings upon my heart, speaking volumes to my soul, I made a vital discovery. I realized that emotion, whether good, bad, or indifferent, was truly the language of the soul. The lives that surfaced seemed to run the gamut. I felt like a living paradox of contrasting emotions that seemed to cross the barriers of time and space, as well as color, race, sex, class, or creed. I was both male and female, literate and illiterate, primitive and sophisticated, an agnostic as well as a God-fearing Christian, a devout Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and Jew who had literally lived all over the world. Amongst my more memorable lives, I remembered a time as a blue-blooded female and royalty living in Scotland with a deep passion for horses, as well as one as an impoverished poacher in England. There were others, such as a free-spirited Spanish gypsy woman, a peasant woman living in France during the time of the French Revolution, a Quaker child, a Franciscan monk, a Jewish widow, a sweetmeat merchant in India, a paddy field worker in communist China, a Roman soldier, and even a gun-toting bandit, to name but a few. One that had seemed particularly poignant, however, was a lifetime in captivity as a black slave, where I saw myself being taken in chains to America from the west coast of Africa. I also remembered a lifetime as a slave in ancient Egypt during the building of the pyramids, in which I saw myself getting crushed between a giant slab of stone. Interesting to me as a researcher and experiencer is why some lives, like the one as the black slave here, why is it particularly poignant to Azmina and other people's reflections and feelings on their past lives? There's some that stand out as particularly touching or tragic, and it interests me why one would, since they're all about the trials and tribulations of being on Earth and being buffeted about by nature and society, why one would seem more than others. And I think it's the attachment. With the ones that you're not attached to, that it just seems like a movie happening to somebody else, you've confronted and digested all the challenges and difficulties of that life and have moved on. But for whatever reason, there's one or two or three, however many lives, where you haven't quite done that. You haven't confronted the issues on the difficulties and resolved them within your own self. Anyway, that's how it seems to me. However, what stood out for me particularly were my past life connections with my father and Uncle Val, namely Chief Justin Milvain, whose biography I had just recently published. Both these individuals, as I recall, had been present during my meeting with the Council of Elders. Now they also appeared to be individuals with whom I had forged strong emotional ties in former lifetimes. I seem to vividly recollect two former lifetimes with each. I clearly recalled life as a primitive savage with my father in Australia, when Australia was still part of the now submerged continental shelf that extends along the northern coast of Australia. It also was my first life as a soul taking on the human experience. In another lifetime with my father, I recall seeing myself as a blind and orphaned relative, trying to survive the harsh reality of life as a newly arrived immigrant in the new world of America. From what I could see, it appeared that my father had always played the role of disciplinarian in my lives. He had tried to instill in me the value of self-discipline and, among other things, had taught me right from wrong. Even though I always felt a little fearful and in awe of him, occasionally even balking at his authority over me, I had nevertheless shared an arm's length relationship with him that still remained very evident. However, it was not the same kind of emotional closeness that I shared with my mother, who, incidentally, had also been my mother in a previous life. As far as Uncle Val was concerned, I was actually a little surprised to discover I'd shared a past life connection with him, despite the fact I had not a real blood connection in my most recent life. I should point out, yes, blood connections are not quite as all-consuming as you might think they are in the soul's journey. Yet, for some reason, the emotions that surfaced here almost seemed more intense than those I had shared with my father. I just felt an overwhelming affection for the man I'd called Uncle Val. From what I could see of my past connections with him, it appeared that an earlier lifetime in Tibet, we had shared a strong spiritual bond. We were both Tibetan monks, where he was my master and I was his pupil. I distinctly recall him teaching me the art of one-pointed meditation using a lighted candle as a prop. In another lifetime together, we had been Native Americans, in which he had been a respected elder and a medicine man who possessed a vast knowledge of natural herbs and healing. He was my grandfather in that particular life. In all my lives with Uncle Val, it appeared that he had always played the role of a teacher and mentor who, in some way or other, had helped shape me into the person that I had now become. As a result, I always felt a deep sense of gratitude toward him that had managed to carry over into my present life. Even though it was not something I had thought of consciously, it had nevertheless manifested itself as an overpowering compulsion to repay him for his past kindness to me. It had led me to actively research and document his life, and in the process, I had managed to absolve myself from a huge debt of kindness and gratitude that I felt I owed him without actually having been aware of it. In that moment of expanded awareness, it suddenly struck me that the source of my present emotions was not necessarily rooted in early childhood. More often than not, that was a carryover from previous lifetimes. I also saw how the snowballing effect of my emotions had the ability to literally put me into human bondage life after life after life. And I realized that until such time as I was clearly able to discharge whatever emotions were festering or lingering in my system, I would continue to return to Earth time after time to take on the human form. Yes, we are somewhat, almost perhaps overwhelmingly influenced by a Freudian type psychology, which relentlessly traces all troubles, traumas, frustrations, and anxieties back to something in childhood. We will get over that stage, but we're still, as a society, we're still in it, at least in the West, where psychology has its grip. Certainly, a number of past life regressionists have started out as belief systems as conventional psychologists, trying to take people regressively back to whatever element in childhood, was the unconscious seed for whatever difficulty the adult is experiencing, and then not finding it, we'll just say in frustration, oh, just go to the source of the problem then. And the source of the problem will, of course, be 1563 or 1297 or whatever. I had thus seen at first hand how the emotions in my life, especially the more painful and negative ones, had a tendency to gather momentum, whether from childhood or beyond, and get rapidly out of hand if unchecked. And before I knew it, that tiny polyp of my emotion had grown into a full-blown cancer, totally disproportionate to the original emotion. Therefore, just like a cancer eating away at my soul, I knew that I would first have to actively seek out and eradicate the malignant emotions that had already taken root in my soul in order to prevent the cancer from spreading farther. Therefore, life in the final analysis, I realized, is a matter of cleaning up our acts by systematically working through the quagmire of our less desirable emotions, like anger, lust, envy, greed, hatred, pride, and worthlessness, amongst others. But just like a spill of crude oil that flows to the top of a pristine ocean, our negative emotions have a tendency to settle on the surface of our souls like a heavy sludge. The more intense and embedded the emotion, the darker and more resistant this layer of sludge, and the greater the number of lifetimes of struggle and effort required to disperse it. Yet one thing remained abundantly clear. This layer of emotional dirt would always remain a separate entity from my soul. The superficial veneer of sludge would never become a part of the finer and clearer water of my soul beneath, as the twain, water and oil, could never mix. Therefore, that much I knew. I would have to clear up the emotional toxicity in my system somewhere along the course of my many lives, even if it took me the whole of eternity to do it. Additionally, I realized that it also required that we work off any accumulated reserves of emotion by explicitly walking through them. This means that we can no longer suppress or anesthetize our emotional pain by using whatever short-term fix we deem appropriate, whether in the form of alcohol, food, or drugs. Even though using these mood-altering substances and engaging in other destructive behaviors may help to temporarily numb the pain inside, they also tend to severely cloud our judgment and further compromise our ability to think and act rationally. Thus, by engaging in substance abuse to help us cope with the pain inside by suppressing, we are in fact compounding the very problem we are trying to work through in the first place. We are further distancing ourselves from our emotions, the very thing that is triggering off our irrational and impulsive behavior. Therefore, in order to neutralize this proliferating beast of my emotions, I realized I would have to first acknowledge my emotions before I could confront the demons that had manifested in my life. The often slow and painful process of getting in touch with our true feelings and laying our pasts to rest, however, requires that we brutally be honest with ourselves. Unless we are willing to confront the truth, our fears, negativity, and our own role in creating our problems, we cannot heal ourselves emotionally. It is a process that requires a critical self-examination. We need to reflect upon both our inner motives as well as our outer actions and subject ourselves to a thorough psychoanalysis, either privately if we are capable of being totally honest with ourselves, or professionally if we are not. There can be no lasting peace in our lives if we allow the memories of our past hurts, mistakes, errors, and omissions to continuously impinge upon our present life. As human beings, we have an inherent need for closure. Until such time as we are willing to let go of the past by showing a certain level of emotional maturity and integrity in our lives, we can never achieve the peace we so deeply crave. And later, a couple of pages later, I seemed to lose all sense of awareness of myself as light flooded my being. But at a deeper level, I felt more alive and more aware than I ever remember being. All my sensibilities seemed to reach out to me from beyond the boundary of my disintegrated form. Then, inexplicably, out of the blue, I noticed a dazzling whirl of light come directly toward me, or that part of me that still remained conscious. It slowly began to crystallize into the brilliant image of what appeared to be a very old man. But as it drew closer, I realized with a start that this swirling mass of radiant energy was none other than myself. I had come face to face with my truer shining self and was literally seeing clear through to the light of my own soul. It was like catching a rare glimpse of myself, or that precious part of myself that had lain dormant beneath the mantle of emotions in an illusory world of matter. It was like being united with a long-lost friend, but mostly it felt like I was marveling at the captivating brilliance of a faraway star, only to realize that that star was me. Now, what was that thing that Aleister Crowley channeled in Egypt in 1904 from a spiritual being? Every man and woman is a star. That's right. Check that one out. In that single flash of self-recognition, I grasped how only in perceiving the truth can one get closer to the heart or essence of the truth and become that truth. It was like being suddenly metamorphosed into this beautiful white light that easily outshone and surpassed my wildest expectations of myself. And it was as though after enduring eons of compression as a lowly and humble piece of coal, I had been transformed into an unpolished diamond in the rough, only to realize my true destiny as the brilliant solitaire that I was. In the process of uncovering my true self, or that radiant part of myself that has always been there since the beginning of time, I rapidly found myself becoming privy to truths I had not quite fathomed before. I now instantly grasped the immutable and self-evident truths of reincarnation, karmic retribution, and personal accountability. And I clearly saw the whole point of life and repeated lifetimes on earth, namely, to make each one of us accountable for our actions and in the process reform ourselves. As diamonds in the rough, I realized that our task on earth was to buff ourselves to perfection against the hard and gritty challenges of life. In fact, the very act of struggling to endure and overcome those painful trials and tribulations in our lives provided that abrasive polish against which to slough off the moral dirt embedded in the crevices of our souls. Yes, that little criminal hiding in the basement. We've all got a couple. Thus, life on earth, I realized, was a matter of getting rid of our impurities and in the process bringing out the true shine and inner beauty of our souls. I now understood, not ideologically or hypothetically, but within my heart and soul, that irrefutable truth about reincarnation. I could see how the many bodies I had donned life after life were just superficial masks or vehicles that I had utilized to exist in an environment of dense physical matter in order to improve myself. But just like a fine wine, this process of improvement and full-blooded maturity took time and infinite patience. It was delusional on our part to think that we, as ordinary human beings, could eliminate all our character flaws and defects and achieve perfection during the course of a single lifetime. Oh, how often have I tried to make that point to Christians? Yet a single lifetime from the perspective of the soul amounted to but a blink of the eye compared to the timeless span of eternity. And as if to lend validity to this awe-inspiring truth, I found myself looking upon the vast vista of eternity from the standpoint of my own light. All the various personalities I had donned during previous lifetimes were on earth were paraded before me like shadowy apparitions in the night. Compared to the real and more substantive light of my soul, it was like catching a hazy reflection of my many selves upon the smooth and tranquil surface of a ripple-free pond. And seeing myself being reflected back as several distinct personalities from the past, I recognized that there was indeed only one actor acting out those different roles and exploring different aspects of myself. Thus, in the process of discovering the real me, I was able to recognize the perpetuity of my own soul. I now saw how the real mover and shaker behind my many changing faces was the same one that had endured and perpetuated itself throughout eternity. And later, seeing my own light was like seeing the breaking of dawn before the full sunrise of my life. Even though I was not quite yet fully into the heart of the sixth dimension, I recognized that I had at least managed to get my foot in the door. And like a quivering arrow on the verge of breaking through into the next dimension, I found myself poised and ready to take off on the outer edge of the sixth dimension. Surprisingly enough, it seemed decidedly darker inside the sixth dimension than it did from outside. But it was not an inky darkness, the kind that one associated with hell, but a soft and almost translucent darkness that seemed more blue and black. And it suddenly occurred to me that in a dimension of formless reality where color or form no longer existed, you saw in the purest perspective of light and shade. Consequently, I realized that some measure of darkness was actually necessary here in order for me to see and recognize my own light. In fact, it was enabling me to cast my own light into the strangely violet skies. The backdrop of purple and indigo skies seemed to lend an almost regal and dignified air to the surroundings, as it also helped to define and accentuate the other lights in the sky. I soon realized that I was not alone and that mine was not the only light illuminating the sky. I could see other lights silhouetted against the dark velvet skies. Dusky, huddled together in the distance like clumps of solid light. It was like looking at live pieces of white-hot coal. Sometimes some seemed inert and barely there, while others were vibrant and fully aglow. Even though I could not distinguish the individual lights within the cluster, I could somehow recognize the unit as a whole. Strangely enough, this recognition came not at the level of feature or form, which did not exist anyway, but rather at the level of their aggregate brightness. In other words, I was able to identify with the individual lights in the unit by the amount of cumulative light that they reflected. It struck me that birds of a feather certainly flock together, but it seemed to be especially the case at this innermost level of light. I also seemed to perceive a greater sense of unity and cohesiveness in this particular part of heaven than I had anywhere else. The emphasis here was on functioning as a unit, on togetherness and unity consciousness, as opposed to division and separation. There was almost a palpable emotion here that I could discern, one that seemed to act as a powerful glue that held everything together. It was the unmistakable emotion of unconditional love, one that not only transcended matter and other emotion, but thought itself. Just then, as an explosion of pure feeling overwhelmed my being, I made another mind-blowing discovery. I realized that truth in the higher planes of reality is felt, as opposed to being rationally understood. It is something that is experienced at the level of soul and is that elusive X factor that adds the necessary element of conviction to your heart. Yes, this is something I've had to, I've chosen to mention to a number of researchers who are not experiencers. Researchers are often very meticulous in their, collection of experiences of others and, comparative analysis. But they often remain in a position of open-minded doubt because they haven't had the experience themselves. And if you probe them on it, you'll find that they have many sort of excuses and reasons for not being an experiencer, which to me is just tantamount to personal fears. So they always seem to stay in that position of open-minded skepticism. Whereas, an experiencer, once you've experienced it, you know. Even if it's just a small out of body and you're up near the ceiling of your bedroom and you look down and see your sleeping body like a piece of meat on the bed. That's all you need to know. You are out there and you are free. I was once again reminded that the medium of expression on the sixth dimension is through the vehicle of our emotions, the universal language of the soul. However, the truth here is conveyed primarily through our higher emotions, namely our emotions of love, generosity, kindness, compassion, mercy. These emotions, I discovered, do not only resonate and vibrate at the higher frequency of the sixth dimension, but they also form an intrinsic part of the fabric of the soul itself. On the other hand, our lower vibrating emotions of anger, pride, greed, envy, lust, selfishness, the ones that we encounter in the lower dimensions and need to first overcome, exist as only a superficial veneer upon our souls. And more than anything else, it was the existence of this layer of moral dirt on our souls that prevented us from connecting with our inner light. Even as I reflected upon this extraordinary truth, I suddenly found myself at center stage in what appeared to be an open-air coliseum of sorts. Incredibly, I seemed to be the main focus of love, attention, and adulation. I could see row upon row of softly bulging lights stretching out before me like strings of luminescent pearls. Some seemed brighter than others, but the overall mood was one of elation and warm jubilation. The air was electric and charged with a joy that could almost reach out and touch. And I almost did. The atmosphere was vibrant and filled with an overwhelming sense of love that swept me into a great tidal wave of pure emotion. It became apparent to me that everyone present was wholeheartedly celebrating my return. But more than celebrating my homecoming, they were rejoicing at that which I had become as a result of my sojourns on earth. Now, I seem to recall, maybe Bruce Moen or even Robert Monroe talking about encountering a being that had sort of graduated from Earth and how intensely bright they were. And it was immediately to be known by the perceiver that this was a graduate, Coming into one's own light is a grand and stupendous moment in the life of an individual. It represents the coming of age of the soul, like that wondrous moment when a bud first opens and sees its true potential as a flower. And in this glorious moment of awakening that typically marks the rite of passage of the soul into mystical sixth dimension of light and symbiotic shade. Gaining a foothold into the sixth dimension is therefore without a doubt one of the most auspicious milestones in the life of a soul, and one, as I was about to discover, that is accompanied by a certain amount of ceremonial. At a physical level, it mimics the pomp and majesty of a grand and lavish wedding ceremony, complete with an eclectic display of light that heralds the birth of a new era in the life of the soul. Curiously enough, I felt like a glowing bride patiently awaiting the call to the side of her beloved. I realized that this certainly was my moment to shine as I found myself being prepared for an initiation ceremony of some sort amidst a great flurry of activity. Until now, I seemed to see myself as a formless concentration of light without color, feature, or form. But as I was draped and adorned in what I refer to as my glitter suit, I once again began to visualize myself taking on the human form. Donning on this shiny one-piece garment made out of a gossamer fine material that resembled an exquisite chainmail helped to somehow contain and reflect my inner light. More than that, it changed the way I perceived myself, as it once again lent a distinctly human dimension to my soul. I suddenly saw myself transformed into an actualized human being. I was no longer the portly figure that I had grown into in the last decade of my life, but a perfectly molded androgynous form that seemed neither male nor distinctly female. Well, you can see the attraction of that, can't you? I somehow felt balanced, complete, and at peace with myself. It appeared that in my most recent life I'd managed to integrate into myself some of the more feminine aspects necessary to complement the stronger male component already present in my repertoire of experiences. I now felt totally and utterly at one with myself. Remarkably, it occurred to me I'd already been afforded a glimpse of some of the ceremony associated with the glitter suit in a dream of some 26 years before. My Uncle Badur, one of the kindest and gentlest persons I'd ever known, had appeared to me in that dream wearing a similar suit, a golden tuxedo made of the same reflective material that I had on now. He had looked positively radiant and appeared to be celebrating his joyous return to spirit. Even though I'd not attached any special significance to the dream at the time, other than a sign that my uncle was alive and well in the hereafter, I could certainly appreciate the deeper relevance of it now. I realized that it had been a wake-up call and a subtle hint from my subconscious to help prepare me for the grandest celebration of my life and my own moment in the sun. Anyway, it goes on in such a manner. And for quite a number of pages, her initiation as an even greater being of light than she had already been. And that is her experience, and I will not draw away from it in any manner. I would like to sort of move on toward the end here. There's a lot to do with her recovery in the hospital and her experiences of people in Florida and back in Canada. And she has a chance to compare her experience with other people's experiences. And how religion sort of colors those experiences. So let me just plunge into that little section. Therefore, before I could bring myself to openly share my experience, this is her back in a hospital, awake in her physical body, I felt that I first needed to independently assess the validity of my experience in my own mind. As I lay awake at night, privately mulling over in my mind the things that I dared not talk about, I seem to recall purchasing a book by Betty Eady in Florida just the day before I landed in hospital. From what I could remember, she had documented her near-death experience in the book, something that I felt might help me put my own experience into clearer perspective. And isn't that fascinating that she'd buy it just the day before? As I leafed through the book that Amin had managed to retrieve from my still unpacked suitcase, one of the first things that jumped out at me and caught my attention was a passage from the foreword written by Melvin Morse. He wrote, "Near-death experiences are not caused by a lack of oxygen in the brain or drugs or psychological stresses evoked by a fear of dying. Almost 20 years of scientific research, well that would be 40 now, has documented that these experiences are a natural and normal process. We have even documented an area in the brain which allows us to have the experience. That means the near-death experiences are absolutely real and not hallucinations." End quote. Stumbling upon this fascinating piece of information that came from a medical doctor and a bona fide member of the scientific community completely blew me away. And that's for those of you who still need a thumbs up from the scientific community, which personally I don't, but I recognize that some of you still do. It suddenly made me sit up and take notice. It independently confirmed to me that what I had experienced was not necessarily a hallucination and forced me to reevaluate my experience in a whole new light. I could no longer dismiss it as just a dream. In spite of our very diverse religious and cultural backgrounds, Miss Edie's compelling account of her journey into the spirit world helped me acknowledge my own near-death experience. Even though there was a gap of over 25 years between our respective experiences, I realized that there were apparently some things in heaven that did not change. Yet at the same time, I recognized that it was ultimately the state of our own individual consciousness in life that determined our particular experiences at death. And that is so true. The notions of heaven and hell, as far as I was concerned, were just temporary states of mind. What I had been searching for all my life was something more permanent, such as the state of being that I had briefly experienced in the light. Moreover, I'd personally never had the slightest doubt in my mind that our spirits survived physical death, and as such, did not feel the need for external proof of God's person to believe in his existence. Even though belief in an unseen God is the ultimate test of one's faith, especially in a world driven by reason, logic, and empirical science, experiencing the essence that is God was for me the icing on the cake of my personal truth. Although I've never thought of myself as an outwardly religious person, I've always had a deep and abiding faith in God and firmly believe in the fundamental truth of all religions. Despite our linguistic differences, I knew in my heart that we all prayed to the one and same God. Thus, I always held the firm conviction that anyone who lived by right and believed in God had equal access to God's kingdom, regardless of the religion that they followed. To profess anything less would have been for me inconceivable. Consequently, when I casually mentioned to my speech therapist, a practicing Christian, that I had experienced the actual moment of my death, I was totally unprepared for the reaction I got. I was surprised at the look of fear and pure panic that crossed her face. With a hand that shook, she reached for my hand and urgently pleaded for me to tell her that I believed in Jesus Christ. Even though it seemed like an unusual thing to say to a Shiite Muslim such as myself, I assured her that not only did I categorically believe in Jesus Christ as being one of the divine apostles and prophets of God, but so did every true Muslim around the world. To deny Jesus' stature as a messenger of God, or for that matter deny any of God's accredited messengers, including Abraham, Moses, Noah, Muhammad, and others, as well as the Virgin Mary herself, would be tantamount to denying Islam itself. An unmitigated belief in all of God's approximately 124,000 messengers, somebody's counted them, including his last prophet Muhammad, was in fact central to the very doctrine of Islam. Although she seemed very taken back by my answer, she was very relieved to hear me openly profess my belief in Jesus Christ. She confessed that she had always been led to believe that, as a child, that only Christians, or those who implicitly believed that Jesus Christ as a Savior, would be allowed to enter heaven and the kingdom of God. And so, more than anything else, she was afraid that I might have been subjected to the fire and agonizing tortures that one had traditionally associated with hell. I suppose it's not uncommon to expect such elitist and misplaced notions of faith to exist in some degree in every religion. Even though her words had seemed a little presumptuous, I realized that she actually meant well. As a matter of fact, as I recalled myself, even Miss Edie had openly declared this same Christian view in her book. She wrote that she was told, He, Jesus Christ, was the only door through which we will all return, and He is the only door through which we can return. Yet, judging from my own experience on the other side, I knew that to be quite untrue. It certainly made me realize that some statements are indeed born out of ignorance. But it also opened my eyes to the fact that I was a little more charitable and magnanimous in my attitude toward other religions than they were perhaps toward mine. Consequently, even though I'd grown quite fond of my speech therapist at the hospital, I could not bring myself to open up to her further. I also could not find it in my heart to shock and awe her by telling her that despite being an avowed Muslim and possibly a heathen in her eyes, I had actually seen a vision of the Christ, along with one of Virgin Mary, Prophet Muhammad, and several others. And even though I truly believed that Christ was the way and a doorway into heaven for many, he was not the only way. She then feels prompted to compare her experience to Miss Edie's Christian account of her near-death experience. Upon examining the essential elements in our respective experiences, I discovered that although there were indeed similarities, there were also some very obvious differences in our perspectives of life after death. Apart from the minor differences in the more physical aspects of our experiences, what stood out for me was that beyond the point of my life review, I also seem to have undergone an emotional clearing and experienced the truth about reincarnation. The ability to visit several of my past lives and recognize some of the invaluable lessons learned from each of those lives certainly gave credence to my pre-existing notion on the subject of personal accountability and karmic retribution. Experiencing the great truth of reincarnation, I realized, was like seeing the snow-capped peak of a mountain range on a clear day, something that is not always visible on a cloudy day. Similarly, I realized that it is only when the clouds of illusion are lifted from our minds that we are able to catch a glimpse of the truth or irrefutable reality that most definitely exists behind those clouds. And as the concept of rebirth or reincarnation clearly did not form a part of Mercedes' dominant beliefs in life, it was not something she was likely to experience in death. It is clearly something that one has to personally grow into during one's own evolution. Similarly, I recognized that since I already had a pre-existing belief in the divine and exalted status of all God's prophets during my present life, catching a glimpse of them was not all that unusual. What had really intrigued me, though, was encountering the strangely ovoid shape of my emotional self before coming face to face with the formless light of my own soul. It struck me that possessing an element of open-mindedness was definitely an asset in the spiritual realm, where the difference was not merely a difference in degree, but a difference in kind. Experiencing a state of consciousness that transcended the conventional notions of paradise, thought, as well as form, made me wonder whether what I had experienced had perhaps bordered on the mystical. This element of mysticism, I realized, was something that was quite commonplace in Eastern religions like my own, which actively embraced the notion of a great formless mass of intelligent light and energy that permeated all levels of existence. Well, I'm glad we got to that, and it touches on an important point. Whether we're active in our religions that we're born into, or actively rejecting them, or passively ignoring them, they do affect subconsciously our expectations. And our expectations of what might happen often determine what does happen, or what does happen initially. So keep that in mind. This also will affect your own sort of out-of-body experiences, consciousness projections, lucid dreaming. Your expectations will be fleshed out, your subconscious expectations. And with that, I will bid you farewell and suggest that we'll continue on with some more NDEs from other experiencers I've discovered while doing this one, and might even get to Eben Alexander's one too, which is was quite the bestseller, and it's quite recently. And we'll see why that was. And until then, I bid you all a fond farewell. Mes amis,